welcome, John. It's so exciting to have you here. I've been looking forward to this episode since we were going to get you on. So thank you for being here. Guys that are listening, John is an acoustic physicist, inventor of the CymaScope, which is a device that makes sound visible. And you've also done the most radical cymatic experiments in the 90s in the Great Pyramid, which I'm so excited to talk to you about as well. So what we love about you and why we've encouraged you to come on this podcast with us is because your work sits in that sweet spot between science and spirit, which is where me and Martin and Tim collide in the center. So tell us how it all started for you. Let's talk about your early youth and what led you to this path.
Well, first of all, just to say I'm delighted to be with you all and to share on my favorite subject. It's a big delight. So my work, I've had two careers. The first career was that of an general acoustics engineer, actually. And that ran for, well, straight 30 years in the acoustics consultancy business. And it was toward the end of that period of my life when my daddy and I went to Egypt on a tour. We'd actually been several times, but this particular time in 96, we found ourselves in the Great Pyramid in the King's Chamber alone, which, we had been before, but usually with a gaggle of tourists. And it's a sacred space, that really. And these tourists usually just make so much noise, and it really completely ruins the sense of spirit in that wonderful place. Anyway, so on this occasion, though, it was towards lunchtime, and I think that's why we managed to get 2 tickets without anyone else being there. And I did something a little bit naughty, which is to lie in the sarcophagus. This is a box of granite, 3.7 tons of rose granite, so it has a kind of pinkish hue, and it comes all the way from Aswan. Not only that, but, just to mention that the rest of the King's Chamber is made of granite. The walls, the floor, the ceiling is all this pink, rose-colored granite. And so obviously the ancient Egyptians had gone to a great deal of trouble to quarry that granite and to bring it to Aswan, bring it from Aswan to Giza, where the pyramid was being built. Well, the way that my reasoning went was that this had to be some really special acoustics reason. Obviously, my whole world was acoustics at that time. But not only that, having experienced tapping just with my fist the side of the sarcophagus, which I don't think they encourage you to do either. Anyway, tapping it rings like a low-pitched bell. It has a beautiful sound. And it's quite complex sound. It's not just like a single frequency, it's several frequencies mixed in. And the reason for that is because it is indeed resonant. Resonance basically means that an object has to move physically a little bit under the influence of sound. A lot of people talk about the resonance of the King's Chamber, which is an incorrect term. In that sense, it's reverberant, but not resonant. And the reason it can't be resonant is because those granite walls, floor, ceiling, are hundreds of tons, in mass. So they can't move under the influence of sound. So we use the term reverberance in relation to that kind of, echo kind of sense that you get when you make a sound in a chamber of that type, or a cave, or anywhere that has hard, flat surfaces in particular. Anyway, in this case, I was fascinated by the resonant properties of the sarcophagus, and so I lay in it. Pretty naughty, but I think I won't be the last to do it, and I'm probably one of millions who have done it over the centuries and millennia, indeed. Anyway, and when I did that, I made a vocal glissando, and to try and establish roughly the prime mode, as it would be called, of the sarcophagus. This is the kind of natural frequency of the sarcophagus. And every object in the universe has a natural frequency. And in this case, something really astonishing happened that I had never experienced in all the years I had been an acoustics engineer up to that point. And that was that my whole body felt as if it was tingling, and there was a kind of a wave of energy rushing up and down my spine at this particular vocal pitch. And I knew it was somewhere just over 100 hertz. I don't have perfect pitch, so I couldn't identify it on the spot, as a musical note or anything, but I knew it was somewhere just over 100. It turned out later, through experimentation, to be 117, which is very close to a B flat. And anyway, at this particular pitch, vocal pitch, it was an astonishing feeling. And reasoned at the time that it felt as though this was probably design, that it wasn't just happenstance, that the Egyptians had actually deliberately gone about designing this sarcophagus to have a particular effect on the physiology. And, many people believe that the ancient Egyptians had what they would class as high technology. I don't actually see it in those kind of terms. They certainly had technologies that we would not use today, the way that they went about things, entirely different to the methods that we use today. And they were very, very brilliant people. But anyway, I wouldn't class it as high technology, but certainly it is technology of a kind. And some people call it a spiritual technology. I really like that term as well. Anyway, so this was a life-changing experience, guys, because, it lit a fire in me to understand what was it about that particular vocal pitch. Why did it have this amazing effect on me? And, goosebumps broke out all over my flesh. It was really quite something. Anyway, so cutting a long story short, I went back again in 96, this time without my daddy. He was just standing by there, quietly watching me and listening, of course. And but later in that same year, in 96, I went back, having gained permission to carry out a whole series of acoustics tests, experiments, which I did, and they were all very successful. And I could spend the rest of our time here actually enumerating them and telling you all about those experiments and how they relate to rebirth symbolism and so on. It's a long story, and I'm not going to go there right now, because perhaps the much more important story happened the next year. So one of the experiments that I couldn't carry out in 96 was a cymatics experiment. I wanted to do it, but there just wasn't time, within the allotted time. So I hadn't taken the equipment to do it. I knew that I couldn't do it, right? Not within the time allotted. And so I gained another permission to go back, this time 97. And this time something happened that was life-changing again. And it was that I injured my lower back 3 weeks before going out to Egypt for this research mission. I was so annoyed with myself because, I had paid a lot of money. They don't give you these permissions for free. I paid a significant sum of money, and I thought, I don't think I can do this. I was so much pain. I mean, it was really excruciating, the pain. And it was because I had lifted something off the floor, bending down at an angle. And, it's a silly thing to do. And also I was very tired that particular day. And I think that contributed to the injury. Anyway, I was in extreme pain. I went to a physiotherapist a few times. I took lots and lots of analgesics. Nothing seemed to touch that pain, really. A little bit maybe with the, with the painkillers, but I was still in extreme pain that day when I crawled into the Great Pyramid in 97. Other people, of course, carried the equipment. I couldn't carry anything other than my camera. Fortunately, the antiquities inspector was very kind and helpful, and he helped me to set up this experiment. And this time, instead of me lying in the sarcophagus, I placed a small speaker there to make sound. And then one of the other interesting aspects to this experiment was, in order to stretch a membrane across the open top of the sarcophagus, this would be the cymatic membrane on which I would be able to see the resonances, instead of just measuring them with standard acoustics equipment. Anyway, in order to do that, I had to level the whole top of the sarcophagus, because have you been there, guys? Have you?
Yeah.
you'll know that one side is slightly higher than the other, and this is due to damage in history. Also, the southeast wall, the southeast corner is broken away quite badly. I had to repair that. So I had to, use, I had planned all of this, of course, and I took an aluminium right angle and expanded styrofoam and, lots of gaffer tape and stuff to do all of these kind of temporary repairs. Anyway, so having done all that, stretched the membrane across the top, I had asked the gaffier of the monument to bring sand into the King's Chamber in bags because I needed this sand. They've got plenty of it, of course, in Egypt, to bring sand in order that I could create tension around the perimeter or periphery of the membrane with 43 little bags of sand equally weighed out to create this even tension. And then, at this point, that took about an hour to set all that up. So I had 2 hours left in which to conduct the actual experiment. And, oh my God, it was an astonishing, again, life-changing experiment, couldn't have predicted what would happen. What I did think would happen is, what I expected, was to see perhaps a series of circular cymatic patterns, probably symmetrical, hopefully symmetrical. And I would then, take photos and analyze those photos back in the lab here and hopefully learn, a lot more about the resonant properties of the sarcophagus. Because usually cymatic patterns are circular. They're usually very attractive, actually quite, symmetrical and pretty on the eye. That's what I expected. But anyway, having switched on the oscillator, this electronic tone generator, and I started at a very low frequency, around 50 hertz. And within just a minute or two, having tweaked the frequency a little bit, because what you have to do with cymatics, particularly when you're using particulate matter, which I was in this experiment, today I use only water, only pure water. But in those days, I was working primarily with particulate, in this case, sand, of course, right? So I sprinkled sand on the membrane from a cappuccino chocolate shaker that I had taken for the purpose. It's like a bit like sprinkling chocolate on a cake or something. Anyway, and I think the antiquities inspector thought I was a little bit nuts, actually. He was he was standing up against the north wall, filing his nails and looking, rather bored. And I think he probably thought to himself, the kind of expression on his face was saying, this guy's, not quite right in the head, but he's paid all this money and it's very helpful for me and my family and so on, let him do what he's doing, it'll only be a couple of hours and he'll be gone. That was the kind of bored look on his face. But then what happened was, just a couple of minutes into the experiment, tweaking the frequency of the oscillator and the amplitude a little bit, I suddenly started to see the sand grains starting to bounce. Well, when you see that with particulate matter cymatics, then you tweak the frequency very, very carefully until you maximize the jump, the height that they're jumping, basically. And then when you see that, when you've got the maximized jump, you then tweak the amplitude, so you bring up the volume, in other words, in this case, into the speaker. And then what happened was this amazing hieroglyph, ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, appeared right in the center of the membrane.
What?
It was an astonishing moment in my life. I'm getting.
Did you film it? Sorry, John.
Yeah, I didn't have film camera, in those days. Well, you got to remember, we're talking here 97. This was the very early days of digital photography.
Right.
I had thought about digital photography, actually, but then I looked at the various cameras that were available. They were very basic cameras in those days. I looked at them, and like a really high resolution photo would be 500 kilobytes.
Right.
That was classed as high res, right?
Yeah.
And I thought, no way, I want the best definition, high definition I can get. So I opted for a monochrome film camera, 35mm film camera. And And there was another, I did actually have a video camera, and I really kicked myself afterwards for not having taken it. But, at the time I was just thinking of all the complexity of everything else that I had to do. And so I just discounted it. And I wasn't expecting to see anything extraordinary. I just thought pretty much ordinary cymatic patterns, but
So
related specific.
sorry to interrupt. What was the hieroglyph?
The hieroglyph was the Jed pillar, D-J-E-D, pillar, and it represents the backbone of the god Osiris. This is the symbol. This particular ancient Egyptian hieroglyph, that's what it symbolizes, the backbone of the god Osiris. And I recognized it immediately, and so did the antiquities inspector, because
Now you got his attention.
yeah, it really did, because he had been, as I say, filing his nails, looking bored. But now he rushed over to where I was standing, and he's like, "How you do that? How you do that?" He obviously hadn't expected, as I hadn't, to see anything extraordinary. But obviously now he was excited. How can I help you? What can I do? This was the way that he was acting. And so we actually became a team, a little team at this point. And he would help me to scrape off the sand after we've taken a photo and measured, noted the frequency. Then he would scrape off the sand. I would sprinkle on more sand, starting from scratch again, right? Then increase the frequency a little. And what happened was I saw a whole series, or photographed a whole series of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, one by one, not at every frequency, by the way. In between these frequencies, there was some really strange imagery, like I can only describe it as coral seas, very strange interwoven kind of imagery, and otherworldly for sure. But then change the frequency a little bit more, another hieroglyph and another. And so it was about 20 minutes into this experiment when, again, looking closely at the sand grains, because every time you scrape them off and then put new sand on, you have to go through the same process again, looking for the maximal jump of the sand at any given frequency. And now I was bending forward, looking again at the jump, when I suddenly realized, guys, there's no pain in my lower back. The pain is completely gone. And in that moment, I can still clearly remember my thought process, because it was so extraordinary that 3 weeks of painkillers and visits to a physio hadn't touched that pain. But here, 20 minutes of sound in the King's Chamber, no pain. This really got my attention. And I thought, wow, what's going on? And then the thought process was, I know what this is. These are endorphins flowing in my bloodstream. I'm excited, like who wouldn't be under those circumstances? And that excitement, of course, it's what's termed as a peak experience. And peak experiences cause many different substances to flow in your bloodstream. Adrenaline can be one of them, but there can also be many endorphins, dopamine, and so many oxytocin, serotonin, many other hormones flow in your bloodstream when you have a peak experience, and they can give you a sense of euphoria for sure, and they also mask pain. If you have pain, they mask pain. And since well, I've obviously studied this subject in great depth now, and I know that this masking of pain is absolutely the case. When men in battle, for example, when they're wounded, they have a peak experience, even though their legs hanging off or whatever, they're not feeling pain, right? Because the body has this system, natural opioid system, to the endogenous to the body. So basically they are there for a purpose. Nature gives them that purpose, to mask the pain. So that's what went through my mind. And I also thought, when I get back to the hotel in a couple of hours' time, this pain's going to come back big time. But it never did come back. So this really got my attention. So 2 things, guys, from that experiment that really were life-changing. The first one, obviously, seeing these ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, it said to me, if this cymatics methodology can tease out ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs from an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus, what else can it do? It could be a new tool for science. And then the other thing, the pain relief in my back, well, not just relief, but pain gone, healing, essentially, right? That said, wow, this needs to be investigated. What is the mechanism that caused that to happen? And this could help medical science in the future, right? So then when I went back to the UK with no pain, I immediately began, literally, when I straight got back to my business, which was an acoustics business, I immediately began putting everything in order to sell that business and to become the scientist, which, even as a teenager, I had wanted to be a scientist. It was actually my daddy who suggested that I go into engineering, and I certainly don't regret that period of my life, because now, as a scientist, I have an overview of science that is merged with engineering. I can see things from a much broader perspective than an engineer can, and a scientist. One of my scientific heroes is Professor Gerald Pollack, and he, like me, he's a water scientist now, but he, like me, started in engineering and then, eventually went into science. And so this is why Jerry has such great ideas. Anyway, in my case, for more than a quarter of a century now, since 97, I've been focused on developing the CymaScope instrument, which, this is one iteration of it you see behind me here. This is the new portable model, which, by the way, I'd like to take that into the King's Chamber. It would be like a coming home, wouldn't it? But anyway, it's called the CymaScope Lite, Light. But the main model, the CymaScope Pro, is the scientific model that we now have operating in labs around the world. Various universities and private institutions are using the CymaScope now. And it can be applied to so many different sciences. And then the other part of my time, this last quarter of a century, has been focused on understanding how sound provides healing, provides pain mediation, but so much more. And next year, well, I should say that I've been teaching this subject, teaching it right now. Actually, there's a course on frequency medicine that I'm teaching with the Shift Network. It's coming up to the end of its 12 modules, but it's, I've been teaching this for a number of years now, this subject. But next year, I've decided to take a hiatus and to write a book on frequency medicine, which I've already begun, but I need to focus a whole year on it, basically, and that's for 26. And so there's my short introduction.
Okay, I've got about 100 questions, but Cherub, I said you should take control of this. So
Well, I'm desperate to hear your questions, Martin, so don't forget them. But thank you for sharing that, John. I've been so excited for our network to hear that story. And it's less of a question, but more of some insight. Tim and I actually went to the Great Pyramid, to the King's Chamber 2023. We took a group there and we managed to hire out that room for ourselves. So we were in there at 3 a.m, the witching hour. It was a full moon. We took a group of about 18 trained sound healers. We were in there together, and one at a time, we all got to lie inside the sarcophagus whilst everybody in the room, Tim had a flute, I had a crystal bowl. We were all chanting and omming and singing together and doing vocal toning. And everybody went one by one. And I went last. And that's actually now the second time I've been able to lie in the sarcophagus. The first was with Diana Cooper in 1111. So, oh no, that makes it the third time, actually. I drank 3 times. But this was my favourite time by far. I was the last person to lie in it. I had the maestro, Tim Reid, at the foot of the sarcophagus, doing some like low-level, deep Mongolian overtoning that I didn't even know he could do. I don't think he knew he could even do it. And we had all of our sound healer graduates around us singing and omming. And I genuinely believe either I levitated or I astral projected out of my body. I'm not sure which one it is, but there was this sense of weightlessness and just freedom and expansion. And it was, to this day, one of the most magical and mystical and powerful moments of my life. And Tim, I'm sure you've got some insight on it as well, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, amazing story, actually, John. And my first thought was with your bad back, getting into the pyramid down those corridor tunnels must have been quite a challenge, because my Cherub and our sort of inside joke is that she said, "Oh, we're filming in the," and I said, "Oh, I'll dress smartly." So I put this beautiful new suit on, thinking we're going to have camera going. She didn't warn me that you have to crawl through on your hands and knees. Anyway, so that was our story. I presume you didn't injure your back on the way out. He was just all good.
Oh, I was really healthy and whole. I was a whole human being again. I mean, obviously, well, in those days, I was a pretty fit person. I was in, well, this would be, what age would I be then? Anyway, it doesn't matter. The fact is, I was a fit person before I injured my back. And I was a fit person when I left the pyramid that day. I actually helped to carry out the equipment. I felt so good, felt so strong, I was able to carry it out. So there had been a real healing. And I now do understand the mechanism, of course, having studied it for so many years. And that's only one kind of small part of the knowledge that I've now gained in terms of frequency medicine. And when I say frequency medicine, by the way, I'm referring to the healing effects of both sound and light. So not just the frequencies of sound, but also the frequencies of light. And now, of course, all these years later, photobiomodulation, that's sometimes called, or just phototherapy, as it's often called in hospitals, is in use in mainstream medicine. Right? So mainstream are now using frequency medicine. If you go to the hospital with some dermatological illness or condition, they won't give you a pharmacological substance. They won't give you a pill. They'll give you light therapy, right? Almost always now. And so this is a great sign. Another great sign is that in mainstream medicine, there's a new clinical term, music medicine, right? This is not music therapy. Music therapy, as you know, guys, has been around, since the 1950s. And this is where a music therapist, a person who's credentialed, is trained, got a diploma in music therapy, they will work with the patient to help the patient recover, basically, or help them in the pre-op stages, whatever, pre or post. They will help patients. But the thing is, with music therapists, there's never going to be enough to go around, right? There's a handful of them in the UK, relatively handful, for example, and of course there are, there's 1 million people in hospitals waiting for, or being treated. So there's never going to be enough to go around. So what mainstream have discovered, lo and behold, is that music has therapeutic abilities, therapeutic qualities without the therapist, just the music, right? And of course, we've known this for a long time, of course, but, in mainstream, it wasn't known. It hasn't been known until relative recent years. It's only about 3 years, I think, when I first came across this new clinical term. And it's not being used in every hospital yet, but it's starting. The snowball has already begun. But if I can come back to you, Cherub, now, just on what you were talking about, how you felt like you were levitating in the sarcophagus, a couple of things I'd like to mention. The first is, well, to ask you, did it at all feel like you were reborn in any sense whatsoever in that experience?
Honestly, it changed my life forever. It gave me such a deep sense of spiritual connection that I hadn't had before. It then led me to go and actually move. I almost moved to Egypt a few years ago. I spent so much time there doing water fasts and really going deep into my spiritual practice there. And it was that moment that really, it was almost like it awakened a new sense of divine purpose in me. And
divine purpose, yes.
Yeah.
In a sense, it is like being reborn. I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but the reason I'm, mentioning this in particular is because, as I hinted earlier, the ancient Egyptians designed that whole spiritual technology around rebirth. This was the, in mainstream Egyptology, the Dr. Renee Friedman, whom I have met on a tour in Egypt, by the way, and she's a lovely, very brilliant Egyptologist. It was Renee Friedman who said that the Great Pyramid, and indeed all the pyramids, are resurrection machines. This is her words. These are her words. And I completely concur with that. And one of the reasons that I do is because of my own discoveries that I made in '96. I carried out all that series of acoustics experiments. Well, one of the experiments in '96 that I should allude to now is I was mapping the resonant frequencies of the sarcophagus with the small speaker in the base, just as I had, in '97 with the cymatics experiment. So to excite the sarcophagus at a given frequency, I used a small speaker. It was a really good high-spec small speaker, so I can get down to maybe just 45 hertz is probably the lowest with it. Obviously, you need a much bigger speaker if you want to go lower than that. Anyway, I mapped all of the frequencies in the sarcophagus, all the modes, the primary modes. And at one particular frequency, the whole sarcophagus began to get really excited. And you could hear it just, as soon as I met this particular frequency, my God, the power in the room, in the chamber was massive, and of course you can feel it in your cavities in your body, your lungs particularly. And then when I then shifted and I obviously noted all the figures and so on my spectrum analyzer.
What was it? Sorry if I missed it. What was the frequency, did you say?
Well, it's just over 200 hertz. I can give you the exact frequencies from a graph, but I don't have them straight off the top of my head right now. So the prime that I discovered was 117. So this wasn't a prime, it was a subprime for sure, just over 200 hertz. But nevertheless, the sarcophagus got really excited. And so then I moved the frequency up just a little bit, just a few hertz higher, again, going very, very slowly with the control on the oscillator. And suddenly the whole sarcophagus began to beat like a heart. Boom, 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 boom. And I'm talking powerful, just like that, right? And it just sounded like a heartbeat, right? And the antiquities inspector, he again came rushing over from where he had been standing, and he was looking scared. He was, and I was a little bit. I tell you, I was a little bit surprised myself because I again hadn't expected anything like that, and I think he thought I was going to damage the sarcophagus because it was so powerful. Anyway, it turns out that this is a beat frequency. I'm sure you know the principle of two frequencies that are very similar to each other. In this case, and they beat with each other. They're kind of mixing and heterodyning with each other. And in this case, the reason it was so powerful, of course, is because of the resonant properties of the granite itself, which contains about 20% of quartz crystal. So this is what makes the granite so resonant. And then obviously moving, when this sarcophagus got really excited at this particular frequency, and then when I moved the frequency higher, the sarcophagus continued to beat, to resonate at that lower frequency, right? It's like it's saying, I like this. I'm not going to just suddenly change because you want me to. It's going to keep on resonating at that frequency because you've got it excited, and it's at a natural frequency. So it's just going to keep on making that sound. So when I increased the frequency to this new frequency, a few hertz higher, the sarcophagus was still beating, still resonating at the lower frequency. So now you have two frequencies simultaneously, and this is what created this really powerful heartbeat kind of sound, right? So this got me really excited, and I thought, I wonder if this has anything, if this was a designed, because you could do this with your own vocal energy. If you could have somebody lying in the sarcophagus making sound, and I'd love to do this, by the way.
Let's all go and do it.
Let's do it. Somebody's making sound at this particular frequency, and then you have perhaps a bunch of people standing around making this slightly higher tone. So you've now got the two frequencies beating together. You could do this, you know, anyone could do it with the knowledge, with the actual data that I have. And so I thought, thinking back to the ancient Egyptians and creating ceremonies in this space, they could have done exactly that, right? It doesn't have to have all this electronic equipment. You can do it with your own vocal apparatus, which is very powerful. And particularly, of course, if you're making these sounds at a frequency that is in some way relative to the resonant frequencies, in this case of the sarcophagus. Anyway, so that went through my mind, and then back in the UK, I got so interested in this whole subject that I actually went to a maternity hospital. I got permission to go and make some recordings of newborn babies and babies still in uterus, right? Which was really quite a privilege, I tell you. And I made these recordings with a special microphone and so on. And then I analyzed those recordings later with a spectrum analyzer, and lo and behold, the frequencies were a really good match for those that I had found, through this mapping of the sarcophagus. Now, you could say, well, that could just be coincidence, for sure. But then later, digging into the research, looking at the ancient Egyptian, the whole story of the pyramid and what had been discovered over the years, there was a guy called Wayneman Dixon, who was an English engineer in 1800 and something, I can't remember the date, who discovered in the Queen's chamber, the one below the King's chamber, he discovered two shafts in the walls of the Queen's chamber that were not visible. The day where he walked in, the Queen's chamber walls had no shafts in them. As you know, in the King's chamber, there are these two shafts that have been talked about as star shafts and ventilation shafts and all these different ideas. But basically, that's not what they were, and at least not in my view, because of what I'm about to share with you now, which is all, coming back to your experience in the sarcophagus, Cherub. Because in doing all this reading, I've read about this Wayneman Dixon guy who had gone into the Queen's chamber and had thought, well, if there are shafts exiting the King's chamber or penetrating the King's chamber, maybe there are shafts in the Queen's chamber that are just not, they're hidden, they're secret, you see. I mean, what a thing to think, and at this point, by the way, the pyramid had been open to tourists for about 1,000 years at this point in time. And yet, in all those years, no one else had the idea that maybe there are shafts entering the Queen's chamber. Anyway, so cutting a long story short, he had that idea. He went round the walls, tapping around the walls, and at two opposing points, he heard this kind of hollow sound. And so he literally chiseled his way. To think of it, nowadays they wouldn't do anything like that, but he just, got a hammer and chisel and chiseled these two holes. And in the northern shaft, there were, as soon as he opened the shaft, with only 4 inches of stone had been left uncut, deliberately uncut into the shaft, into the Queen's chamber. In the northern shaft, he found 2 little devices. One is a little brass hook that looks a little bit like a pair of scissors. It got 2 curved blades that meet at a point, and it's called a peshen kef, sometimes also called a peshesh kef in ancient Egyptian. And what it literally is a device for severing the umbilical of a newborn baby, right? That's what it is. And the other little thing that he found, object, was a spherical ball of stone, perfectly, or as near perfect as they could make it, almost perfectly spherical, right? So what's that? And what's that got to do with newborn symbolism? Well, it's the seed, right, from the uterus. It's the egg, the ovum, from the ovaries, rather, that comes through into the uterus. So now you get the picture, I think, that what the ancient Egyptians were doing here, they were creating a model of the reproductive system, in this case of the goddess Nut, N-U-T, and the goddess Nut was the sky goddess, right? You often see her arched over the sky, you know, in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic depictions and reliefs and so on. But in this case, it was all about rebirth. So what they were doing is they were creating here, in a sense, a model of the reproductive system of the sky goddess. So why do we have two lots of shafts, one in the king's chamber and one set in the queen's chamber? Well, the reason for that, this is just hypothetical now, because you have to reason, well, why would they do that? Well, because they actually held two ceremonies. One was related to the celestial realm, and that would be in the king's chamber, obviously, because in those cases, those shafts actually did exit the monument, and they were pointing at the celestial realm. Basically, I'm trying to think of the name, the duat. They were pointing at the duat in the celestial realm. The other set of shafts in the queen's chamber, they were concerned with the earthly realm. So you might know that those shafts don't exit the monument and never did exit the monument. They stop about, I don't know, something like 60 feet away from the monument. So they had deliberately, and don't forget that the queen's chamber would be built before the king's chamber. They went up in courses, right? So the queen's chamber was built. They created these shafts from the queen's chamber, deliberately not cutting it into the king's chamber by only 4 inches, right? Think of it. And then think of the challenge, the engineering challenge of every block of stone related to these shafts had to be specially cut, specially very carefully positioned, and then when they built the next course, do the whole thing again, and then the next one and the next one, all the way up until they got to, like I say, something like about 60 feet from the exit of the monument, at which point they put a doorway, right? And it's called Ganten. It's now today is known as Gantenbrink's door. The reason it's named after Rudolf Gantenbrink, who created a robot that he sent up in 92 or 93 into the shafts. He'd been, asked to do it, to create ventilation, basically. And he found this doorway. So what's the doorway all about? Well, in my model, behind the door is the ovary, is the ovum, basically, the ovaries of the sky goddess Nut. And then why did they not cut through into the queen's chamber? Well, how I found this out, at least this is all again hypothetical, but I'm pretty certain, pretty confident about it. I was standing in a London bookshop, very near to the Petrie Museum, which is one of my favorite little museums in London. And this was a Waterstones bookshop, and I went to this section on midwifery, and I was reading this book on midwifery, and I found this passage in this book. I nearly dropped the book. It was a big book as well. And I found this passage where it said that the ovum passes through the fallopian tubes until it meets the isthmus. This is the narrow section of where just before it enters into the womb itself, into the uterus, right? And then the isthmus opens for 1 day only in the cycle. The egg passes through, the ovum passes through, and then it closes. So what I reasoned was that the ancient Egyptians, somehow they knew this about the human body, the female body, and they were deliberately modeling this, you could say, in stone. So in other words, when they performed the ceremony in the queen's chamber, this opening of the isthmus would be symbolically open, just as many other aspects of their ceremonies were symbolic, right? They weren't physical; they were symbolic. So the isthmus on the northern tube, say, would open 1 month, and then they would perform the same ceremony the next month, and it would be the southern tube, because they alternate in the female, right? So anyway, that's my real. And the little sphere, well, that's the ovum, basically, and all the other elements in the pyramid, all the other chambers, like the grand gallery, well, that becomes the birth canal, basically, and if you think of the angle of it, well, I can go into all the details about this, but really, it's a very strong model of how they saw the reproductive cycle of the goddess Nut. And and I'm really excited about it, obviously, that you can probably tell. I think it's the ancient Egyptians were such clever people. And, a lot of people have said to me, really, they would go to all that trouble, to do that, and the symbolism, you see the kind of look on their face. And then I would say to them, well, talking about symbolism and the ancient Egyptians, and particularly the Great Pyramid, if you go outside the pyramid and look at the solar boat, right, they dug into the bedrock of the Giza Plateau some enormous pits, basically, a huge cost, labor. And into these pits, they put solar ocean-going vessels, all flat-packed, just like, you get an IKEA, piece of furniture, you've got to put it together. Every single component of the boat flat-packed and put into the pit, and then covered over the top with giant stones, and then a lot of sand, so that you don't even know it's there, right? So for thousands of years, nobody knew that those boats were there. They'd gone to all that trouble. And so how did they envision these solar boats being used in the celestial realm? Well, we can only guess, but we guess that they must have reasoned that they would magically be reassembled by the gods, right, to be used, in the celestial realm. I mean, they were just flat packed. So it's really extraordinary the length that they went to with their symbolism. So I have no problem at all, with believing the model that that I've envisioned. It's like, it seems very reasonable, actually.
Okay, I have to ask you a bunch of questions now,
Sure.
or kind of observations. As you were talking, I've been jotting down some things. You mentioned earlier this idea of it could be regarded as a reanimation machine, right? The whole resurrection. But I would suggest it could be a reanimation machine in a different set of physical expectations. So we're all assuming that we are, obviously we have to look at everything through the lens of historical knowledge, but to them they could well have not just thought of it as symbolic, but thought of it as their reality. That should a pharaoh, whoever it is, or the queen, this person at the top of their particular sociological pyramid would almost attain godlike powers, and this is part of their sociological belief system, possibly, which connected them to the heavens or the gods or whatever they believed in. So maybe, just maybe, they felt that this was like a machine,
Cosmic computer,
some kind. Their like highest technology. They could obviously not. We say it as symbolism now. I liken it. The metaphor I'd use is, we go to see all the ruins around the world. I mean, I've been to so many different. I've never been to Egypt. which I intend to do soon. But you know, and we rarely think about what these buildings look like in the original intention, let alone we think of them as like, oh, it's just in the past sometimes. I mean, obviously experts can reconstruct what they look like, and you know, incredibly colorful buildings that are now just gray, etc. Anyway, that's just a thought I had. Secondly, the boats, I think, is fascinating because it kind of fits in with the conceptual idea that there's possibly, it's a bit like confirmation bias, right? So I just thinking about it now. It's like if they really thought they were demigods, the pharaohs or whatever, and they obviously thought they had some kind of beyond physical powers, and that they were creating some kind of nexus between the world they couldn't witness but they believed in, and you know, the earthly nature of matter. Maybe they just thought, it's not so much like, oh, wouldn't it be nice? It's like when they bury the symbols with, you know, pharaohs and stuff and all that. It's like, oh, it's just a ritual. Well, I've got a slightly different view. I think they thought they had power in those objects, and that they had an actual realistic chance of making a difference at some future point. I don't know. What do you think? It's just a theory.
I agree in general with what you're saying. That feels right to me for sure. They were actually, you know, they believed that they were gods. They were deified. You know, a pharaoh was a deity, and many other people in Egyptian history were deified. Imhotep comes to mind. You know, he was a famous physician and architect, and many people believe that he was actually involved, certainly in the design of the very first pyramid, the step pyramid at Saqqara, for example. Maybe even had some input rather into the Great Pyramid construction or design. But regardless of that, they were certainly deified. And I was going to also mention the opening of the mouth ceremony, which you may know about. You know, the opening of the mouth ceremony was again about rebirth. And there are many depictions that you see where the pharaoh has, well, he's been mummified, he's bandaged head to toe, and then he stood upright. They literally stand up, you know, the mummified pharaoh. And then the Shem priest comes toward him. This is the priest dressed in a leopard skin, and he comes toward him with the Peshen Kef instrument, which is the you know, normally used for severing the umbilical in midwifery in those days. But in this case, it's not for his umbilical, it's for his mouth. So when he's bandaged head to toe, he approaches the dead pharaoh, and he symbolically, I don't know whether they actually did it in reality, but they certainly symbolically cut open the bandages at the mouth in order to reanimate him, right? So this is very much, you know, along the lines that you're thinking here, to reanimate this dead pharaoh. But it is all symbolic. Obviously, he's not going to be, you know, he's dead and he's been mummified. They even took out the brains because they didn't realize that the brain was so important, you know. They just discarded the brain. They didn't have any concept of what the brain was, which is a strange way.
Interesting.
I think we're all conditioned, aren't we, to know that this is where our thinking happens.
Yeah. The other thing would be, it's quite esoteric, I think, but the idea of, I think maybe we think differently about death. In other words, they may well have, I'm not an expert on Egyptology, you clearly are, but I'm just theorizing. Maybe they didn't think that they were really dead. Maybe they just thought that the soul still, or the animus still resided in that physical object, and that it just entered a different form. Who knows?
Did that exactly right, actually, and they call that the Ka, which is the spirit, the Ka, basically the spirit of the pharaoh, and that spirit could go anywhere. It could go into a statue, or one of the other ideas, relating to pyramids here, is that there's never been a pyramid found with a sarcophagus that contained a mummy. And this is why there's so much conjecture about, well, why did they bother building pyramids and putting sarcophagi in them, if they weren't intending to inter a dead person. I could cite, for example, what's called the unfinished pyramid, which was found at Saqqara by Zachariah Gonaim in the 1950s. And when he found that pyramid, it was largely buried. It was, unfinished. But what was finished was the sarcophagus, and that was in its chamber, sealed with a wreath on the top. And also, in the way of getting into this pyramid, they had to go down this tunnel that was full of rubble, but they also found lots of jewelry, beautiful, some of the best gold jewelry ever to come out of Egypt, found in this tunnel. So then Gonaim reasoned, quite reasonably, I think, that this had never been entered before by robbers, because they would have found all this jewelry, right? So anyway, he then gets to this clay sealed wall, opens it with the eyes of the press there. He invited the press. There's a wonderful book called The Buried Pyramid about all of this. Gets into the chamber, finds a sarcophagus, sealed, opens it under the eyes of the press, empty. Right? So why they go to all this trouble? Well, one way of reasoning this, guys, is that what they were doing was creating what has been termed a secure rest home for the peripatetic Ka, the wandering Ka of the pharaoh, who could come to Earth and basically have a nice rest, in his rest home kind of thing, safely, because of obviously the sheer volume of the mass of stone around him and so on. A nice secure rest home for the peripatetic Ka. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But it is partly true that there's never been a pyramid found with an actual burial, an intact burial. So anyway, should we switch topics? Because I don't know how much time we want.
We've kind of run out of time, but what I'd like to suggest to you is, that was so mind-bending that I'm kind of exhausted now. Can I suggest that we have a part 2 of this?
I would love to, because there's something we've not even touched on yet, and that is John's amazing new app called CymaScope. And I think that we should definitely get our viewers and listeners to download it. I've downloaded it myself, and it is the most incredible way to actually see the visuals of sound. We've spoken about cymatics before, Martin, on different episodes. Here it is. Look at that for the viewers.
I'll give over.
So what this is, this took 2 years in the making. We did have an earlier version of it, actually, but this particular CymaScope app took 2 years to design and build, and it has a huge range. It's way beyond the vocal range. It starts way down at 27 hertz, which is actually the lowest note on a piano, and it goes up to over 2,200 hertz, which is way higher than the highest soprano can sing. But anyway, the main aspects of this app are, as you can see, it will make any sound visible. It's making my vocal sound visible now. What it's doing, it has a fast Fourier transform working in the background there, and it's literally looking at my voice frequencies and very quickly finding the dominant frequencies in my voice, and then putting the relative, the appropriate imagery on screen very quickly. And it has the ability to output video, so you can use this with your Tibetan bowls, your crystal bowls, your gongs, anything, and it will make those sounds. There you go.
Let's do an experiment. What happens if I plug it?
I just bought it, so there you go.
With that, make some.
You're about 10 quid richer.
How lovely.
You'd have fun with that app.
So you can record the video of that.
Yes, you can record and output the video. You know, the one little thing that we really were a bit concerned about was in doing that, you know, the idea that somebody would record, say, Taylor Swift's music, right, and then put that, you know, put her music, you know, onto Facebook or somewhere. You know, can you imagine the consequences of that? Because of copyright. So when you press the record button, what happens is the app immediately takes you to a page showing you in different languages a warning, you know, not to do that, basically. Because, in other words, use your own music only. Don't steal anyone else's music to do this.
Yeah, exactly.
Otherwise, you're going to get yourself in a lot of trouble. But
Well-
it's a powerful app. And
Sound enthusiasts out there, CymaScope app, you get it on the App Store. I did it myself this afternoon. I've been having loads of fun with it.
The good news is that we'll have a chance to play with it before we do part 2. So
yeah,
Oh yeah, I feel like we haven't even scratched the surface with you, John. I wanted to talk more about you know, the way that music affects the body and the different frequencies. So hey, bring it on, part 2. I'd love that.
So we'll contact you offline and we'll arrange another time. Thank you.
I look forward to it.
It's absolutely incredible. Do you want to say goodbye, then?
Well, yes, I do, and thank you so much, John. Like Cherub, there's so many things I wanted to ask you, actually, so absolutely fascinating. I will hold the thoughts and the questions.
Write them down.
Yeah, Tim, you're never going to remember them. I'm concerned.
I tell you what, the one thing I do want to bear reference to next time, just going briefly back to the Egypt story, was when you said the spirit goes into a statue. I remember Cherub and I were in Luxor. Do you remember we went into that very secretive room and the energy coming from
Hathor. It's Hathor, yeah.
the spheres of light, etc. So I want to talk to you about that, the relationship between sound and light, many, many things. We could do 6 of these and talk.
Oh, I'd love that.
I think we could, but anyway, I'm really looking forward to part 2. So
Absolutely. We've only done the top 9th of the iceberg. So, all right, guys, listen, that was fantastic. Thank you so much.
enjoy the rest of your day.
What a world of wisdom and insight, John. Thank you for sharing, and so excited to see what you create next in the world. Looking forward for the book as well. Frequency Medicine, bring it on.
Wonderful. Look at that. Great. Wonderful.
See you later.
See you guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you.